Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is July 11th, 2025, Friday, July 11th, 2025. First story out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and this is titled The Mistletoe Bride of Talbot Block. On January 1st, 1929, an old structure in Nashua, New Hampshire, was being demolished. Underneath the floor of the attic of what had once been a rookery, workmen were astounded when they discovered a human skeleton. The 100-year-old building at Old Union Block at High and Main Streets faced demolition from the top floors down since it had been condemned. For the past 50 years, stores occupied the first floor, offices were on the second floor, and 4 small apartments were on the third floor. Even a Universalist church had been housed in the top floors of the building 75 years before. However, by contrast, some other businesses were of a dubious nature. New Hampshire was a dry state and suffered from speakeasies and bootleggers long before Prohibition was the law of the land. The old block was reputed to be the longest bar in the state. A crew started to knock off the roof and rip up the attic floor. The workmen knew that knocking out these old buildings sometimes yielded a stash of valuable items, including coins, and the time-honored custom was finders keepers. So every time the rotted planks yielded to crowbars, they looked carefully through the debris to see what lay below. Suddenly one of them came across a board that resisted its pull, and he saw it had been double-nailed. What the man saw caused him to drop his tool and swear an oath. The others surrounded him as the foreman came up the stairs. What they beheld was the skeleton of a human foot. There was no mistaking what it was. So many men gathered on that part of the flooring it gave way with a crash, and from the plaster that fell to the story below, more bones were found. Police were called, and then the medical examiner came to the building. The cavity was explored, and a leg bone came to light. The bones that fell from the ceiling were part of an arm and a pelvis. Whoever hid the bones took great pains to erase ways of identifying of what turned out to be a woman. He removed her clothing and stripped the flesh from her bones. It was confirmed the skeleton was not one that was ever used by a medical school or physician. Access to the attic of the building was by a steep stairway in a corridor running between the apartments. It was unused except for storage of personal belongings of the occupants of the building. A space of about 3 feet in height separated the ceiling of the apartments from the floor of the attic. It was in this space where the skeleton was found. The strangest twist in the case was the discovery of a photograph of a woman in an old-fashioned dress left close to the human remains. The photograph was identified as a young bride who vanished from Nashua 27 years back. What a strange thing to find among those dissected bones. Was it a sentimental mistake on the part of the murderer, or just a decoy to lead police astray? There were other reports of a book found near the bones which dealt with the white slave traffic. Police supervised the rest of the demolition. They sifted through debris sent down by the chute and found among them pieces of human vertebrae. From this small collection, the medical examiner determined they belonged to a woman in her 20s. As the work progressed, a skull was pulled from the bottom of a partition wall with a tattered newspaper from the Nashua Press dated March 28, 1902. The newspapers had long since closed its doors. Police examined records of who rented the building, but the spaces had been let and sublet to numerous people, including bootleggers, which usually gave false names and addresses. The police turned to the photograph and found only one studio in Nashua that dated back to 1902, but it had changed hands 5 times. Most of the old plates had been thrown in the trash, and those that remained did not match the unknown woman. However, a citizen of Nashua, A.G. Tipping, had been a partner in the Nashua laundry during 1902 and recognized the girl. He said her name was Blanche Mentor Blackmun. She came from Boston and worked in the laundry. She married and suddenly quit her job. He remembered her well because she was one of the prettiest girls that ever worked there. Police reviewed the laundry's records, and it showed that Blanche left without notice in 1902. However, most thought she left because of her recent marriage. Mr. Tipping remembered her as being in her early 20s, which corresponded with the medical examiner's findings. Others came forward and confirmed the identification of the woman in the photograph as being Blanche Mentor, or the Boston Beauty as she was called. Everyone agreed that she left town abruptly and never wrote to any of her friends. Was Blanche the victim? Inspector McCarthy, who was in charge of the investigation, thought the clue was too good to be true. He knew that whoever killed this woman had kept her somewhere else and took the time to deflesh her bones. He probably minced the meat and disposed of it in myriad ways. The eyes, the hair, and even the brain had been removed, leaving only clean bones that appeared to have been boiled as well. Inspector McCarthy knew this took a lot of time and patience, and only a calculating mind knew exactly how to plot each step, including scattering bits of the skeleton through the floor and walls. Could someone this meticulous have left behind a photograph? The main motive for stripping the flesh away from the bone was to prevent odors that soon would have betrayed the strange burial. Once he was sure this would never happen, he felt sure the building would never be demolished in his lifetime. The inspector said, "No, that job was done by a thorough, hard-headed, practical man who must have thought of every contingency, including the fire hazard, which might have caused the block to be torn down at any time. That murderer did not knowingly leave anything that would help, and he was certainly not a careless fellow." Police diligently continued in their investigation and found Blanche's husband in Billerica, Massachusetts. Mr. Blackman came to Nashua and said he divorced his wife in 1918, and she immediately remarried a man named Edward C. Marshall and moved out to Denver. She died later that same year, and he received a letter informing him of the death of Mrs. Marshall, your former wife. The inspector was not surprised, and this confirmed his suspicion that killer knew Blanche left town suddenly and that people would be wondering what happened to her. Somehow he got her picture and thought that by dropping it with the bones, the search would be led astray. He knew if any discovery was made, he would read about it in the papers, giving him enough time to make his escape. That is, if he was still alive. The biggest obstacle was how much time had elapsed since those bones were hidden away. If they could learn who owned the picture, they could trace how he acquired it. Perhaps follow his movements and find him in some neighboring town. A young woman went missing. However, like some mysteries, the more you know, the more it deepens. Even though many people identified the picture as the Boston Beauty, Mr. Blackman said the woman was not Blanche. Jenny Mentor Anderson, a cousin, also denied it was her. Now, what was the fate of the Boston Beauty? Investigation into the fate of Blanche Mentor Blackman Marshall proved that indeed she was not the Mistletoe bride of Talbot Block. She was born in 1887, and despite her title of the Boston Beauty, happiness was not in her stars. She married Ruel Blackman, as recounted by the citizens of Nashua. On April 5, 1913, she gave birth to a premature baby. And on October 16, 1914, she gave birth to a stillborn son. As well told police, they divorced, and she married Edward Marshall and moved to Colorado. She died in childbirth along with her daughter, Etta May, in 1918. She was 31 years old. Considering the inspector had two credible persons confirm the picture was not Blanche Mentor, he had to wonder how this killer had been able to find a picture of a woman who looked remarkably close to the likeness of a woman who conveniently left Nashua abruptly. It also matched Blanche's height and weight. He never found the answer to those questions, neither the name of the lady hidden in the attic, nor more importantly, the name of the one who put her there. Now, it seemed that murderer had visited the apartments at Union Block building in the past. In October 1909, the body of Roxy Baker, whose real name was Arzelia or Zelia Chicoine, was found in her apartment at the Union Block. A janitor had smelled a bad odor coming from her room. Roxy's decomposing body was found with a loop of rope around its neck, which was tied to a bedpost. However, her windpipe was untouched. Described as a prepossessing blonde of about 40 years of age, her face was drenched with blood, and there was a blood-stained cloth over her face. The bedclothing was also blood-stained. Besides this, there was no sign of disorder in the room. The bed had not been slept in, but there were indications of a person having lain upon it. Roxy Baker had appeared before the Superior Court 2 weeks before her death on a charge of keeping liquor for sale in her apartment and was fined $15. The police believed this was murder. However, they were mystified as to the motive, since two valuable diamond rings were found, one on her finger and the other on the floor near the body. Little was known of the woman's background, except that she had a sister living in Claremont. She had once been married to a man named Frank Baker, but his whereabouts were unknown. As to whether Roxy Baker committed suicide or was murdered is unknown. There was reference made to prior murders in the building, but it seems the Union Block had a reputation for skullduggery, long before the Mistletoe bride of Talbot block was found in her attic tomb, and it was so commonplace the stories were not covered by the local newspaper. So, this is the question. Were those two murders, or those two women's deaths, were they connected? Did they have some serial killer? Even though back then they didn't use that word serial killer. Doing away with women? But, again, nobody knows. Whoever he was, if that was the scenario, he got away with it. And maybe there were other women. All right. Okay, next story is titled The Legend of the Dark Watchers. Dark Watchers, and this is from Stranger Than Fiction Stories. Dark Watchers are being described as tall, featureless silhouettes. Not always, but sometimes they wear a brimmed hat or carry walking sticks. Most often seen between dusk to dawn, they appear as emotionless figures that watch travelers from afar. Their legend originates in the Santa Lucia mountain range, and if you try to approach them, they disappear. In 1542, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo was the first European to sight the Santa Lucia Mountains, and they were named by cartographer Sebastian Vizcaíno 60 years later. The first accounts of these figures date back to the 18th century, when the Spanish settlers referred to them as los vigilantes oscuros. There was no reference to the Dark Watchers from the Chumash who lived in this area prior to the arrival of the Spanish. Sightings of these silhouettes have been reported for 300 years up to present day. They are seen on cliffs where no human could climb, looking out to sea. Some have described them as being only 3 feet in height, akin to fairy folk. However, most reports describe them as being very tall, between 7 and 10 feet in height. They have been sighted in the area from Avila Beach to Monterey. John Steinbeck described the Dark Watchers in his 1938 short story Flight. Quote, Pepe looked suspiciously back every minute or so, and his eyes sought the tops of the ridges. Ahead, once on a white barren spur, he saw a black figure for a moment, but he looked quickly away, for it was one of the Dark Watchers. No one knew who the Watchers were, nor where they lived, but it was better to ignore them and never to show interest in them. They did not bother one who stayed on the trail and minded his own business. End quote. Steinbeck's son, Thomas Steinbeck, would report later in adulthood that as a child he had seen the Dark Watchers. With Benjamin Brode as illustrator, he wrote In Search of the Dark Watchers. In it, he described where the Dark Watchers sense or smell the presence of gun oil and other modern-day materials like plastics, which in part is why they are so elusive. They appear to be for hikers who carry only low-tech, old-school gear. They also appear to have exceptional hearing and impeccable eyesight. Thomas Steinbeck described where his grandmother, Olive Hamilton Steinbeck, believed she had contact with the Dark Watchers who stay hidden in the forest. She told her family she left fruits and nuts in a basket in a shaded alcove east of a trail on Mule Deer Canyon. She would walk this path on her way to teach school in Big Sur. After a couple of weeks, she would return, and the food was gone. And in its place were seashells and feathers. She believed they were trading with her. In modern times, hikers tell of feelings of being watched, and when they turn, only a fleeting glance is caught of a tall, dark figure. Some say they are omens of bad luck if sighted, perhaps because they resemble the Grim Reaper. Others say they are benign, and only watch humans from afar. There are reports of Dark Watchers in Canada, Texas, Alabama, and the eastern Sierra Nevada mountains. A pilot reported seeing 7 of them while flying north of Vandenberg Air Force Base in 2011. Okay, little cat, come here. Wait a minute. I have here a helper. Here we go. Even those traveling along the Pacific Coast Highway at dusk have looked out their car window and seen those lonely figures. Excerpt from Robin poem, Such Counsels You Gave to Me, originally published in 1937. Quote, he thought it might be one of the watchers who are often seen in this length of coast range, forms that look human to human eyes but certainly are not human. They come from behind ridges to watch. He was not surprised when the figure turning toward him in the quiet twilight showed his own face. Then it melted and merged into the shadows beyond it. End quote. The following are stories told by those who have disquieting sightings of what they believe are dark watchers. Quote, my lady and I were walking along the beach in Malibu one night, and when we were walking, she stopped and just kept looking up ahead. I looked where she was looking, and I saw something crouch down and stand up. It stood taller than an average person, and I heard her say, you saw that thing stand up, right? After she said that, we saw another climb down a big rock on the coastline. These things don't look natural and had no features to say they were just other people. We turned around and just headed back toward the car. Okay. Next story. Okay. I live in the countryside of Madeira. About 2 years ago, I saw a tall, thin figure standing in the shadows staring at me. I couldn't see the face, what type of clothing it had on, nothing. I froze and kept my eyes on it. My cousin saw it too, and she dragged me inside the house. I didn't want to keep my eyes off it. I thought if I turned my back on it, it would get me. Just today, another cousin came out last night to have some drinks. He said while he was outside, he saw a tall, thin figure watching him. He also froze. He said when he blinked, it vanished. He ran inside to us, and we all ran outside looking for the shadow. Other story. I was driving home from a beach trip with my girlfriend in 2016, going through Cuyama. It was pitch black outside. We saw a large shadow figure glide across the road in front of our headlights. No notable features, just a large, dark, shadowy creature. If she wasn't awake to confirm what I just saw, I would have chalked it up to me being tired, but she saw what I saw. We let it go until a few days ago, when we brought it up again. Searched up shadow people in Cuyama and learned about dark watchers in Santa Lucia. This is so crazy to learn we aren't alone in this experience. Next one. Back when I was a teenager, I used to go hiking in the desert in a mountain range where I lived 7 miles outside of Blythe, California. One afternoon, I went deeper into the mountain range than I had ever hiked before when I felt like I was being watched. The hairs on my arms stood up. I quickly started looking around, fearing a mountain lion was nearby, when I looked up towards the top of the mountain and saw a small cave-like opening at the top of a sheer wall. There, looking out towards the valley, I could see a hooded human figure. I could not see its face since it looked like it was covered by a thin veil, but the hood and cloak looked tattered and ripped. The figure made no movement. I turned around and started to walk back the way I came, and never went back to that area of the mountain range. The area was not well traveled, since there were no dirt roads or tracks, so who knows what was up there. All I know is it was not human, and I've never been back since. This was back in the mid-90s. Next one. I've camped a few times in the Santa Lucia Range near to Cone Peak, right near the coast, and the 1. I take it that would be US 1 or Highway 1. We were camping up on some of the coastal ridges. They're overlooking the ocean, and definitely experienced some very strange energy. My first time up there were 3 of us, including myself. One person and myself both actually spotted one of the watchers up on a high ridge, partially obscured by low-flying clouds. Neither of us were familiar with him at this time and chalked it up to a tree. When we slept that night, we felt an indescribable discomfort and decided to keep driving north the next morning. Next story. My boyfriend and I were driving from Arroyo Grande to Stockton. About an hour outside of Arroyo Grande, we saw a dark human figure in the hills. It was several hundred yards away from the road and seemed to be trudging laboriously uphill in the 95-degree sun. Despite rubbernecking multiple times to try to get a better look, we could distinguish no identifying marks, no seams of clothing, no hint of shoes or anything. Just solid black walking up the hill under the burning afternoon sun. There was a small station with a tank and satellite on the opposite side of the road. I wonder if we didn't see some strange ritual. Next story. I was hiking up a remote trail up to 33 and OJ. I was about an hour up the mountain, no people, no cars in sight as I was hiking. I had this eerie feeling I was being watched. I looked up at the top of the mountain. It was a black figure. I waved, jokingly, not really thinking the object was a person. It waved back. Thinking I was maybe tripping or that it was a tree waving in the wind, I took a puff of my cigarette only to see the figure blow out a plume of smoke as well. I started seeing it flowing, and I say flowing, almost floating vertically. I ran like hell back to my car, spraining my knee in the process. Next story. I live in the country in Canada. I saw a 7-foot man very slowly walking along the fence line. He seemed to be a solid shadow, but because he appeared to be behind the 6-foot fence, I didn't get a good look at him. Every time it is twilight, I look at all the fences to see him again to confirm what I saw, but I haven't seen him since. Next story. I'm a long-distance runner, and most of my training is in up the good old Californian mountains. I had a long run scheduled, so I headed out. I headed to Veterans Park here in the San Fernando Valley. Time of day was 2 p.m. I was running and up in an area where no human could climb without gear. I saw a black figure in plain daylight. I've never seen anything like it up the mountain. It was as darker than dark, and I could not explain it. A year passed and I saw it again, and in the same spot. Next story. I saw a dark figure about 7 feet tall in one of the mountains by Vernal, Utah. It was a late winter, lots of snow. The moon was full and the light reflected off the snow, so I had no problem seeing. I worked nights for a seismic company as a troubleshooter. I heard a crew member say on the radio that he saw Jeepers Creepers, and he dropped everything he had and ran back to his truck. We thought that he was up too long without sleep, so they sent me to his location to finish what he had to do. While walking on top of the mountain to fix the problem, I saw it 20 feet in front of me. My heart started beating fast. I tried to run, but it was hard because of the snow. As I was running, it seemed to float on the snow. It moved really fast and started to circle me, then stopped. All I had on me was a pocket knife. I pulled it out and started to pray for God to help me fight it. I started to run towards it. I got about 10 feet from it and started to move back fast. I lost sight of it in the dark. I never saw its face, and it had a robe like the Reaper. I don't know what it was. Next story. I remember one day my friend and I were coming back from Los Angeles. We passed the San Luis Obispo Reservoir, and we drove on the road. And as we drove on the road, I saw something at a distance down at the end of the mountain. It was a really big human figure, but it wasn't. It had a black cape, kind of like the Grim Reaper, and it was leaning over, holding onto a staff at a puddle of water, so that it is what it seemed to be at a distance. It was in daytime, too, so I could identify it wasn't a person. Even in mid-light, he was very black and reminded me of a raven. I told my friend that was driving to look over at the mountains, and surprisingly, she was able to see a glimpse of it. I asked her what she saw without giving her my details, and she said exactly what I saw. She only looked at it for about 5 seconds, but she was able to see it. She almost lost control of the car too when she looked away at it. And I begged her to go back and see it, but she was very tired of driving already. These dark watchers are real. Next story. One early morning when my car was in the shop and my sister was taking me to and from work in Salinas over San Juan Grade Road, we were coming home to the San Juan Bautista Hollister side when we saw a very large dark figure standing at the edge of the mountains, which is extremely weird since I've never seen anyone cross over the barbed wire fence, and I travel that road daily and at all hours. We drove slowly, behind the figure, noticing it staring off into the distance, valleys and mountains, which is Fremont's Peak. It appeared to have a large cape with straight shoulders that were very broad. It seemed to have a hunch on its back. From a distance, I thought it was a condor. When I got closer, it stood almost 10 feet tall. It did not notice us driving behind it, but when we found a spot on the cliff, rode to turn around and get a better look, it was gone. Next story. Many, many years ago, I was with a friend driving through a dirt road in Moreno Valley near Alessandro, the old east part, near what I believe were old abandoned barns that I always had heard were haunted when my friend's car broke down. This could have been coincidence. It was a beat-up Volkswagen Bug. It was dusk at best, and there was no way we were going to make it out of the field before it was pitch black. and instead of chancing getting retardedly lost and or hurt in the dark, we decided to sleep in the car and set out in the morning to go get help to tow the car. This was way before the days of everyone having cell phones and quick help. As we were killing time in the pitch black now, we were hanging out inside and outside of the car, sharing smokes, and we started to distinctly see what looked like black shadows. Even they distributed, completely encircling us. They did not move, they stayed motionless, but were of significant size, and based on the distance, I would say at least the size of a small car like the bug we ourselves were in. Whatever these were seemed hunched over, perhaps kneeling. Time passed, they never moved, and though we walked around the car and got in and out of the car to see if what we were seeing was some sort of optical illusion, yet we couldn't explain or discredit what we were seeing. To this day, it racks my brain. Next story. Up here in the eastern Sierras, we see the Dark Watchers all the time. They are always out at dusk and dawn. All you see is just a tall, dark silhouette. They almost look like horses standing on their hind legs with the assistance of a walking stick. It's pretty creepy, and nobody has ever seen them close up. They disappear the moment you try to get closer. So there you go. Has anybody seen a Dark Watcher? I mean, a lot of people think of Hat Man or Shadow People, but these apparently are mostly seen outside on a cliff face. Okay, next story, also out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, is titled The Orange Farm Murders. Let me take a quick sip here. In South Africa, most modest estimates are the more than 50 people are murdered every day. Children are not special and are not spared, especially since they are high in demand to be used in dark rituals or muti murders. In April 2020, the South African reported on the murder of a young boy believed to have been sacrificed in a muti ritual. 5-year-old Ms. Wandile Sitho was reported missing by his grandmother, Gogo no Nomumpumelo Zitho. She'd been bringing up the boy since he was 5 months old. When the grandmother went to the police station, after several fruitless hours searching for her grandson, she found the neighbor who owned a nearby tavern already there. She was shocked to hear that he told police he found the boy's body in his tavern and he didn't know how it got there. Community member Anna Mukubu, who entered the tavern, described it thus, quote, "When we got there, we found Mazwandili naked, standing in an upright position. His hands and feet were bound. There was a muti bottles and a handkerchief that had small ropes in it." End quote. There was a red rope tied around the child's neck. This is evidence the child was used in a muti murder. Later, the grandmother said, "He, the neighbor, was telling me not to go to the police station and that we would find Wandi by the end of the day. He was so reassuring, but I was concerned and wanted to find my grandson. I feel betrayed because he was one of the first people to start a search party for Wandi when I told him he was missing. He didn't tell me that my grandson was in his tavern the whole time we were looking for him. He said he also didn't know that Wandi was there." End quote. A post-mortem report found that Ms. Wandili died due to suffocation. The township south of Johannesburg was plagued with cases of missing children and cruel child murders. By September 2020, 4 children were killed, the first being Wanzili Zitho. A few days after the discovery of the boy's murder, Ponso Mokalanka, 29, was charged with the boy's murder. She, along with her husband, were arrested. The tavern they owned was located less than 100 feet from Wazandili's home. Charges were not placed against the man since the prosecutor said there was currently no prima facie case against him. The charges against the woman were drawn on August 28th. But before Ms. Wandili's murder on June 18, 2020, a waste picker came across a plastic bin. Inside was the body of Ansia Keha, 3, with a stab wound to her upper body. Police investigated the case but with no success in finding the culprit. Mofo Makondo, 8, and Simpiwi Mensina, 6, 2 friends were found dead on September 19, 2020, only hours after being reported missing. The electricity had gone out in the neighborhood that night, but neighbors searched for the girls nonetheless, calling it off at 4 a.m. The naked bodies were discovered at 5:30 a.m. outside a tavern on Extension 4, the same where Mazwandili Zito's murder had taken place. The girls had several muti implements placed on their corpse. Post-mortem report found that both had died due to suffocation. Ponso Molaka, the same woman suspected in the murder of Mazwandili Zito, was rearrested. Police spokeswoman Peters revealed she was illegally in the country and had killed the girls 3 days after being released from custody. Peters said, "Police can confirm that this is the same suspect who was arrested in April 2020 for the murder of another child, a boy who was her neighbor, after the child's body was found in her house. The boy had been reported missing earlier in the day on April 15, 2020, and the search led to the woman's house where the child's body was found. The woman and her partner were both arrested, but charges were withdrawn against the male suspect. The murder case of April 2020 has been temporarily withdrawn in court pending the outcome of the toxicology report. The 29-year-old woman was released from custody on September 16, 2020, 3 days before the murder of the two children. In September 2022, Ponso Molanka was sentenced to 3 life terms for the crime. Every year, approximately 3 children per day are killed in South Africa, according to official records. Many believe the figure is undercounted. Shanaz Matthews, the country's leading expert on child homicide, thinks there are many victims that are completely missed. There is no investigation nor prosecution into the crime. She said violence has become entrenched in the psyche of South Africa. How do we break that cycle? The number of children killed are not going down. If anything, they are going up. Joan van Niekerk, a child protection expert, recounts numerous cases tainted by police ineptitude and corruption. Even though some children fall victim to their own family members, there's a large number which are killed in use of medicine murders, which they are mutilated and tortured alive, since their agony is believed to increase the juju of the body parts. These blood rituals are mostly used to invoke prosperity, riches, and good luck. Some believe political correctness has allowed the practice to flourish, since it is one part of indigenous African culture, which the media is not particularly eager to let the public know about. Tribal healers hold a wide belief in the power of human sacrifice, and some have been known to kill their own children in ceremonies. In 2011, there was a 10-year moratorium on crime statistics. In 2001, approximately 2,500 South Africans were caught in possession of human parts, many of which were traded through the hospitals. Africans with albinism, which means they're albinos, are especially at risk since their body parts are highly prized due to their supposed power. Their organs can cost tens of thousands of dollars, leading investigators to believe that human sacrifice is practiced in some of the highest circles of African society. In 2009, according to the Red Cross, at least 50 albinos were murdered for their body parts. The belief in the powers of the Muti is not a recent phenomenon. A testimony described in Muti ritual murders in Natal from chiefs to commoners, which was between 1900 and 1930, proved that victims, especially children, were slaughtered in order to meet the demands of San Gomas to complete their rituals. The Torso and the Thames case from 2001 is thought to be the first Muti murder in England. In 2013, it became known that a brisk black market trade of human body parts and organs was being operated at Raleigh Fitkin Memorial Hospital in Swaziland, a South African country. It was described as an open secret. Buyers came from all parts of South Africa to buy bones, hearts, brains, and other organs. It is thought between 60 and 85% of South Africans believe in witchcraft and black magic, and in the medicinal effects of Muti to cure them or improve their lives. South African crime figures show that in the 6 months from April to September 2022, 558 child murders and 294 attempted child murders were committed. It's suspected many of them were tied to Muti rituals, even though statistics do not differentiate on motive. Gerard Labuschagne of the South African Police Service's Investigative Psychology Unit investigated dozens of Muti murders. He confirmed the removal of genitals is the hallmark of Muti killings, and that is normally before death. Writing in the Journal of Investigative Psychology and Offender Profiling in January of 2004, he explains the underlying belief system of Muti. Quote, In traditional African beliefs, it is assumed that there is only a certain amount of luck in society. Each individual receives a portion of that luck. It is therefore believed that if another person is successful, they have obtained an extra portion of luck via devious means, usually with the intervention of the supernatural. Setbacks or calamities such as drought or illness are signs that the natural and social order have been disturbed. One means of obtaining this extra portion of luck or restoring the natural order is through the use of strong muti. It is with the strong muti that muti murders are often associated. Muti, made from human body parts, is considered to be exceptionally powerful. In Swaziland, there seems to be an increase in grave robbing, where the body parts removed are similar to those used in muti. Also, theft or sale of body parts from hospitals and mortuaries has occurred. It is uncertain whether or not the traditional healer would be able to tell if a body part is removed pre or post mortem. End quote. There are so many crimes tied into Muti that a special unit called the South African Police Force Occult Related Crime Unit was created in 1981 by Dr. Kobus Hound of God Jonker. If you want to, there's a separate article on him and what his efforts were. Over here on Stranger Than Fiction Stories, there's a link to it. It's very interesting and very, very concerning. All right, next story is out of Mysterious Universe. This is titled Abductions by Fairies and Fairy Imposters. Fairy lore goes back centuries and can be found in a wide variety of diverse cultures. Although the modern image of fairies is that of benevolent, glittering winged beings flitting and cavorting amongst the trees of a forest, the attitude towards fairies also varied greatly from tradition to tradition. In some accounts, fairies have a rather mischievous, even malevolent undertone, and in some lore, these entities are seen as being very real indeed. An early account of a fairy abduction involves a young woman named Anne Jeffreys of the parish of St. Teith, Cornwall, in England. Born in 1626 to a poor laborer, she had always been a bright and inquisitive girl with a wild and active imagination. One of the things that really captured her attention and became almost a sort of obsession for her were all the various tales of fairies that were all around her. The lore of her area was steeped in such tales, but for her this was more than mere stories. As a child, she would spend much of her time out in the woods trying to find the elusive entities and commune with them. And this habit would continue right up until she was a young woman, when she came to live as a servant in the family of a Mr. Moses Pitt and his wife Joan, where she did domestic duties and also served as a nanny and nurse to the couple's two young children. At 19 years of age, she was still going out into the forest all of the time after her chores in her free time, looking for fairies and pixies, singing out to them in the hope of some sort of response to validate her belief that they were in fact real. Little did she know that her efforts were not completely in vain and that she was being watched. According to the tale, one day Anne was out knitting at the Pitt home when she suddenly went into a convulsive fit that left her ill and bedridden. Several days passed with her in an unconscious state, and when she awoke, she would have quite the tale to tell. She would relate to her family and those around her that she had been out there knitting when she had heard laughter and had looked around to find 6 diminutive men in green outfits and hats and with unusually bright eyes, led by one with a red feather in his cap, had crawled out of the bushes to approach her. The leader of the group had been unafraid of her, jumping into her palm and then up onto her shoulder to kiss her neck and hair. And before long, all of them were crawling all over her. That was as one of them had put his hands over her eyes, after which she had felt a prickling sensation, and then all had gone dark. The next thing she remembered was waking to someone shouting, "Tear, tear," and when she looked around herself, she saw that she was upon a grassy knoll in unfamiliar, fantastical land of palaces, temples, and lush gardens, as well as azure lakes and a plenitude of brightly colored birds and other animals frolicking about. She was then dressed in an ornate flowing silk dress and led to a palace where there were fairy folk everywhere eating, drinking, and dancing. It would seem that she was there in this strange land for many days, during which time she fell in love with a fairy with a red feather in his hat. This made the other ferrymen jealous, and they followed them around everywhere they went. One day, a mob of these ferrymen would surround them, and as her fairy lover tried to defend her, Anne once again found herself losing consciousness, fading to black as she was immersed in a thrumming vibration that shook her entire body and a buzzing in her ears. The last thing she saw before leaving, before everything went dark, was her fairy lover lying wounded on the ground. When she awoke, this time she was back where she had started. The fairies nowhere to be seen. She was at that time disoriented, and when her family members found her, she was going into convulsive fits. Oddly, though, many days had passed for Anne. It seemed as if no time had passed in the real world. For the next few weeks, she would be ill in bed, moving between unconsciousness and lucidity, and she would demonstrate some side effects of her bizarre ordeal. It seems as though she had developed a certain clairvoyant ability, such as reading the future and knowing who was at the door. She also said that she frequently saw the fairies lurking about, although no one else could, and she had also gained the ability to heal people by touching them. On one occasion, during a person's injured leg, just by laying hands upon it, and soon people were coming from far and wide, coming to be healed by her hands. Such was her purported powers that she was kept as a prisoner at the house of the mayor of Bodmin for a time on charges of being a witch. Although she never formally charged with witchcraft, she was what was whispered rumors were saying. Interestingly, another power she apparently had was to go without food for long periods, yet remain healthy and vigorous, insisting that the fairies were keeping her fed. The case made quite a stir back in the time, and Anne herself would go on to marry a man named William Warren and fade from the spotlight, refusing to talk about her experience or perform any more healing magic. The story would go on to be spoken of throughout the area ever since, with a letter from Moses Pitt, her benefactor's son, to the Right Reverend Dr. Edward Fowler, Bishop of Gloucester, setting it in stone, and Jeffreys would die in 1698, taking any secrets to the grave with her, and having avoided talking about her experience for most of her life. What was going on here? Is this just a folk tale, or is there something more to it? It is unknown, and the case has become embedded in local myth without a real answer in sight. Was this actual fairies, interdimensional interlopers, or possibly an alien abduction? Or was it just a hoax and the ramblings of a misguided young woman? Or even just pure folk lore? There is no way to know, and whatever the case may be, it remains one of the weirder tales of fairies there is. In some cases, it seems that the targeted victim of a fairy kidnapping manages to escape. In 1839, there was a woman by the name of Annie McIntyre, who seems to have just been saved by her brother from being abducted by the fairies. Her report would read, quote, "Yes, by good luck, my brother happened to be coming home from Cardenag that night and heard the fairies singing and saw them dancing round me in the wood at Carrowkeel. He had a book with him, and he threw it among them. They then ran away." End quote. One early and quite sinister account with alleged evil fairies happened in 1911 when Walter Yealing Evans Wentz published a book called The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries, in which there is an interviewed 73-year-old Neil Colton, who claimed that as a youth in 1853 he had had a rather strange and frightening fairy encounter indeed. Colton claimed that one summer day he had been put with his brother and cousin gathering berries out in the countryside when they heard some inexplicable ethereal music wafting through the air from beyond some nearby rocks. When the group went to investigate, they claimed that they had come across a band of fairies dancing in a clearing, and one of these little folk, a woman dressed in red, suddenly noticed they were being watched and rushed forward with decidedly aggressive intent. The mysterious woman is claimed to have surged forth with a stick or rush in her hand to strike the cousin across the cheek, after which she reached out to grab Colton's brother's arm to keep from falling. This sent the group scurrying away in a panic, and at some point, on their flight back to their home, Colton's cousin collapsed to the ground, seemingly dead. The girl's father and a priest by the name of Father Ryan then came to the scene, and Ryan said a prayer over her body, after which she slowly and groggily awoke. The priest would conclude that it had only been her grabbing Colton's brother that had kept her from being taken by the fairies forever. In 1925, we also have a report of a woman who was pixie-led, told by Mrs. G. Herbert of Dartmoor, England. In 1925, Herbert was riding a horse on the moors of Dartmoor, England, on a fine sunny day in an area of the moors that she knew well when she suddenly and inexplicably became confused and lost her way. Oddly, she recognized her surroundings, but some persistent fog in her mind was befuddling her and preventing her from navigating any of it. She seemed to know that this was a result of fairies trying to lead her astray for the purposes of abducting her, so she tried a trick to protect herself, involving turning her pockets inside out. Apparently this worked, and she was able to continue on her way without further incident. Indeed, some of the strangest reports of fairy abductions come from those who have managed to come back to tell the tale. A very weird earlier report also has to do with what is called a fairy circle, a sort of portal between the land of the Fae and our reality, which in this account supposedly existed near the farm of Lywin and Finan, near the Vale of Neath in South Wales. In 1755, two servants on the farm, Rice ap Morgan and Llewellyn Walter, were walking towards the farm one evening when Rice stopped and told his companion he could hear music playing, although Llewellyn could hear nothing. Rice told the Llewellyn to continue back home while he went to search for who was playing the music and talk to them. It was all very odd since only Rice could hear the alleged music, and Llewellyn suspected that he was just trying to get out of work, finally just leaving his friend to head home. When morning came, Rice was nowhere to be seen, and so Llewellyn told the boss what had happened the previous night. The area was searched, and they even searched the nearby alehouse, but there was no sign of Rice, and suspicion began to fall on Llewellyn that he had done something to him. This would continue for a full year before the story found its way to a local farmer who thought it might have to do with fairies. He asked Llewellyn to take him and some friends to the exact spot where Rice had disappeared, and the farmer claimed that it was a fairy circle and that Rice had been snatched away within it. At that moment, Llewellyn could allegedly hear harp music that no one else could, and the farmer noticed that the servant's foot was partly within the circle. When all present placed their feet within the circle, they found that they too could hear the music, and they could also see little child-sized figures dancing about along the missing Rice. Llewellyn then grabbed his friend and pulled him out of the circle, after which Rice said he wanted to dance a little more, as he had just gotten there. When asked what he meant, Rice claimed to have been there for scarcely 5 minutes, even though a whole year had passed. Indeed, he had no inkling at all that he had been gone so long, and he also found himself unable to clearly remember his time with the little people in that circle. The next morning, the circle was checked to find that it was trodden down and filled with tiny footprints the size of a person's thumb. Oddly, after leaving the circle, Rice's health would rapidly deteriorate, and he would die not long after. What happened here? Some of these cases can be quite harrowing, such as an account also written in the 1910 book The Fairy Faith in Celtic Countries by W. Y. Evans Wentz. The case revolves around a witness who says that when he was a boy, he was out with his brother and cousin when they were not almost abducted by a group of fairies. He says of the bizarre experience, quote, "One day just before sunset in midsummer, and I and a boy then, my brother and cousin and myself were gathering bilberries, or whortleberries, up by the rocks at the back of here, when all at once we heard music. We hurried around the rocks, and there we were within a few 100 feet of 6 or 8 of the gentlefolk, and they dancing. When they saw us, a little woman dressed all in red came running out towards us, and she struck my cousin across the face with what seemed to be a green rush. We ran for home as hard as we could, and when my cousin reached the house, she fell dead. Father saddled a horse and went for Father Ryan. When Father Ryan arrived, he put a stole about his neck and began praying over my cousin and reading psalms and striking her with the stole, and in that way brought her back. He said if she had not caught hold of my brother, she would have been taken forever." In the same book is a story of a man who tells of his frightening encounter with what he calls the gentry, another word for fairy. One day, as he was out near a place called Ben Bulbin, he had a curious encounter with a fairy that seemed about to abduct him. He says of the rather odd series of events, quote, "When I was a young man, I often used to go out on the mountain over there to fish for trout. or to hunt, and it was in January on a cold, dry day, while carrying my gun, that I and a friend with me, as we were walking around Bulbin, saw one of the gentry for the first time. I knew who it was, for I had heard the gentry described ever since I could remember, and this one was dressed in blue, with the headdress adorned with what seemed to be frills. When he came up to us, he said to me in a sweet and silvery voice, "The seldomer you come to this mountain, the better. A young lady here wants to take you away." Then he told us not to fire off our guns, except because the gentry disliked being disturbed by the noise, and he seemed to be like a soldier of the gentry on guard. As we were leaving the mountains, he told us not to look back, and we didn't. Another time I was alone trout fishing in nearly the same region when I heard a voice say, "It is, barefooted and fishing." Then there came a whistle like music and a noise like the beating of a drum, and soon one of the gentry came and talked with me for half an hour. He said, "Your mother will die in 11 months, and do not let her die unanointed." And she did die within 11 months. As he was going away, he warned me, "You must be in the house before sunset. Do not delay, do not delay. They can do nothing to you until I get back in the castle." As I found out afterwards, he was going to take me, but hesitated because he did not want to leave my mother alone. After these warnings, I was always afraid to go to the mountains, but lately I have been told I could go, if I took a friend with me. End quote. In some cases, people have been reported as being gone for a length of time, only to somehow find their way back, usually dazed, confused, and with no clear memory of what has happened to them. One report from the fairy faith in Celtic country speaks of this and explains how something about what is called fairyland is a place in which time runs differently, and which has a way of preventing the abductee from being able to speak of it. It explains, quote, "Persons in a short trance state of 2 or 3 days' duration are said to be away with the fairies enjoying a festival. The festival may be very material in its nature, or it may be purely spiritual. Sometimes one may thus go to fairy for an hour or two, or one may remain there for 7, 14, or 21 years. The mind of a person coming out of fairyland is usually a blank as to what has been seen and done there. Another idea is that the person knows well enough all about fairyland, but is prevented from communicating that knowledge. A certain woman of whom I knew said she had forgotten all about her experience in fairy, but a friend who heard her objected and said she did remember and she wouldn't tell. A man may remain awake at night to watch one who has been to fairyland to see if that one holds communication with the fairies. Others say in such a case that the fairies know you are on the alert and will not be discovered." End quote. Similarly, we have a case that relates to the bizarre ordeal of a woman who disappeared near a fairy fort, usually a mound, cairn of rocks, or boulder that draws in fairies and has great significance for them. The report reads, quote, "Finally, as an example of this darker aspect of fairy encounters, this account from the Irish Folklore Archives demonstrates the upset and the confusion which many feel before they can even speak about what they believe happened to them. In this case, a family happened to live close to an ancient fairy fort, and one morning as a woman is using a spinning wheel, she noticed a tiny person standing by the door of the house. When the woman stood up and walked to the door to investigate, she was taken away by a group of small people. When the family arrived home and noticed their aunt had vanished, they searched everywhere in the vicinity but found no sign of her. They searched the drains, the ditches, and even the fairy fort itself. It was on the 3rd day of her disappearance that one of the family was walking by the fort when they saw the aunt kneeling next to it. She had vanished while holding a carving knife, and this was stuck in the ground next to her. The aunt could not speak for days after her return, and it was only then that the family learned of her fairy abduction." End quote. In most cases, the person is just a sort of whisked away, and this often happens to the very young. Another case concerned a young woman by the name of Annie McIntyre, also from Ireland, according to an account in a 1909 edition of the Preston Herald. Quote, "Annie McIntyre, a venerable County Derry woman, has a sublime faith in the fairies. On being examined at a meeting of the Limavady Pension Committee as to her age, She fixed the time of her birth as Halloween in 1839, giving for a recollection of the fact the startling reason that she has been stolen by the fairies. In reply to the chairman, the woman said that she was as certain of her abduction by the fairies as she was alive. After carrying off the infant, she continued, the wee people indulged in revels and dancing in the woods at Carrowkeel, which were fortunately overheard by her brother when returning from Cardomag. The brother had a Bible, difficult to see the fairies being frightened off by a penny dreadful, which he threw into the wood, and scattered the fairies when he lifted his baby sister in his arms and carried her back in triumph. Further question, the witness said her mother relatives were overjoyed at her safe return, and gave themselves up to feasting and merriment. This was the only incident by which witness was able to determine her age, of which no record appeared in the census of 1841 or that of 1851. Fairies have supposedly displayed an alarming habit of kidnapping human beings, in particular babies, and there are many such reports. One account listed on the Fairyist website details the report of a woman who in 1844 gave birth to a baby. Sometime later, the infant was lying in bed with the mother and father when the mother awoke to find the baby gone. She would soon find that it had been taken by the fairy folk, and the report would say of the incident thus, quote, uttering an exclamation of fear lest the fairies should have taken the child, she jumped out of bed, and there, sure enough, a number of the little sandy things had got the baby at the foot of the bed and were undressing it. They fled away through the hole in the floor, laughing as if they were shrieked, and snatching up her child. On examination, she found that they had laid all the pins head to head as they took them out of the dress. For months afterwards, she always slept with the child between herself and husband, and used carefully to pin it by its bedclothes to the pillow and sheets, that it might not be snatched hastily away. This happened in the old house which stood where the new one now stands at the south side of the vicarage gate. A woman, as she heard tell, had a child changed, and one, a poor thing, left in its place, but she was very kind to it, and every morning on getting up she found a small piece of money in her pocket. My informant firmly believes in their existence, and wonders how it is that of late years no such thing have been seen. End quote. Indeed, babies are traditionally prime targets for fairies, and to protect their infants, people would often sprinkle them with holy water or hang bars of rods of iron over their cribs, as iron was said to ward fairies off, with even adults often carrying around iron when venturing into a fairy's territory. This was among many precautions mothers would take to protect both themselves and their babies, from fairies. 20th century fairy researchers W. Y. Evans once said of this, quote, the fairies were wont to take away infants and their mothers, and many precautions were taken to safeguard them till purification and baptism took place. When the fairy power became ineffective, placing iron about the bed, burning leather in the room, giving mother and child the milk of a cow which had been eaten of the moth and pearlwort, a plant of virtue, and similar means were taken to ensure their safety. If the watching woman neglected these precautions, the mother and child or both were spirited away to the fairy bower. This does not seem to always work though, and in another account, we have a case from the site Irish Central from a witness called Grace. She writes, quote, don't believe in fairy abductions? My granny would have a sit down with you and soon set you straight. From the very day of her birth, Granny's parents carefully laid their iron fire poker across the basket she slept in. They were believers, you see, in the good people. Well, wasn't everybody back then? But times have changed, and now there are fewer believe. Who knows, maybe the good people like it that way. My granny thinks so, and she says she should know. I've lived one foot in our world and in the other foot in theirs, so she says. You see, when Granny was but a few months old, the good people tried to steal her away. While a drop of whiskey on her breath, she'll tell you that she was asleep in her wee basket when there was a commotion out back of her parents' cottage. They lived in County Limerick. At that time it was a farm with mainly sheep, she says. And anyway, all hell had broken loose, 'tween sheep and dogs and Granny's mam and pop, upped and ran outside to see the damage. As it happened, there was nothing to see, nothing at all. It had been nothing but bluster, for the sheep and dogs were only calm and dozy, which was strange in itself. Granny's mam was pretty canny, and she hightailed it back to the cottage to find Granny still wrapped tight in her blanket, laying at the threshold of the front door, fast asleep, across the room from her basket. When she was older, Granny was told by her parents that the good people had distracted them so they could steal her away, for she was touched, having one blue eye and one green eye. Only they couldn't get her out from the cottage on account she'd been baptized. Granny will tell you the iron bar did nothing to keep the good people from reaching in her basket, and what's more, it wasn't true, her being baptized. It's what her parents told anyone who asked. But in truth, she was yet to be baptized, and only a day or two after the visit, as Granny calls it, her parents took her on the quiet to the priest for her to get the job done. So we can only guess that the good people... There's good people and there's a bad cat back here. So we can only guess that the good people dropped Granny to the ground when they heard her mam approaching. I think Granny enjoys telling the story and wears it as a kind of badge, actually. It is remarked by many who have known Granny that she has lived a charmed life on account of her touch by the good people. There could be something to that. She is nearing 100 years old after all and is as bright and feisty as ever before. End quote. There are also some traditions of fairy abductions in which the little folk were said to leave behind an entity called a changeling, which was a fairy impostor who merely looked like the person who had been abducted to act like a placeholder and take the abductee's place. In the lore of numerous countries in Europe and beyond, a changeling was more or less a copy of a child, left by usually fairies, but sometimes elves, trolls, or some other spirit, depending on the culture, to replace a human child that they abducted. The fairies would sneak into homes, spirit away the human child, and leave an imitation version, a changeling, in its place. And this would be done for several different reasons, depending on the lore of a specific region. Sometimes it was because fairies coveted human children and wanted one for themselves. And indeed, some human children were said to live out the rest of their days in the fairy realm. Another occasion was said to take a human child as a slave or servant, out of malice or revenge, or even as no more than a prank. Fairies might also take a human child if they thought they weren't being cared for properly, or even because the changeling itself had requested to grow up in the human world. For instance, some older fairies supposedly requested to be made into changelings in order to become young again and start life anew in the human world. The children taken were almost without fail the most beautiful, which is why in some traditions, such as those of Ireland, it was seen as bad luck to look at a baby with envy or praise its beauty too much, because this was thought to draw the fairies' attention to it and make the child a target. Although they looked indistinguishable from a human child, once a child was replaced by a changeling, there were varying ways to tell if they were an impostor, again depending on the region. In many traditions, changeling children were likely to look pale and sickly, and may not grow up to be normal size. They were often said to have long teeth, scraggly hair, or some hidden physical deformity or birth defect, such as extra toes. Changelings were said to have enormous appetites, eating for more than a normal human child of their size would. They were also typically said to be more intelligent than a normal human child of their age. It was also said they would demonstrate skills or abilities that their human doppelganger had not possessed. With psychic abilities often mentioned, they were often said to have an uncanny offness about their outward appearance, which was hard to put one's finger on, but would be unsettling to all who looked at them. Other traditions speak of the changeling becoming uglier with age. For instance, in Wales it was believed that the changeling would start out beautiful, but become even more hideous as it grew up. People around the changeling child might also suffer physical effects, such as being unable to move their limbs, which is called being fairy-struck. Changeling children were also commonly described as acting very oddly, as well as never smiling or laughing when people were watching, although they would do so when they thought they were alone, and many times changelings were mute or spoke very little. The English poet and topographer George Waldron who lived in the Isle of Man during the early 18th century, would claim to have seen a changeling child and described it as follows, quote, "Nothing under heaven could have a more beautiful face, but though between 5 and 6 years old and seemingly healthy, he was so far from being able to walk or stand that he could not so much as move any joint. His limbs were vastly longer for his age, but smaller than infants of 6 months. His complexion was perfectly delicate, and he had the finest hair in the world. He never spoke nor cried, ate scarcely anything, and was very seldom seen to smile. But if anyone called him a fairy elf, he would frown and fix his eyes so earnestly on those who said it as if he could see through them. His mother, at least his supposed mother, being very poor, frequently went out a-charing, and left them a whole day together. The neighbors, out of curiosity, have often looked in at the window to see how he behaved when alone, which whenever they did, they were sure to find him laughing and in the utmost delight. This made them judge that he was not without company, more pleasing to him than any mortals could be. And what made this conjecture seem the more reasonable was, that if he were left ever so dirty, the woman at her return saw him with a clean face and his hair combed with the utmost exactness and nicety." End quote. For a long time, changelings were seen as a very real threat, with many families constantly on guard against their child being abducted and replaced by these doppelgangers. And as with many other supernatural creatures, there were various methods to keep the changeling away. A common theme in many regions was the use of iron, thought to have a powerful repelling effect against the creatures, with iron objects such as knives and scissors left around the child's cot to keep them at bay. Others always included constantly watching the child, laying the father's clothes on the bed, keeping a fire constantly lit in the room, baptizing the child, and other strange customs such as placing urine around the bed. Most traditions also feature various charms, amulets, herbs, or salves that could be used to keep changelings away as well. But despite all of these precautions, there was never any certain guarantees that a child wouldn't be taken and replaced by the fairies. In almost every tradition of changelings, they were not seen as a desirable or benevolent presence, mischievous at best, and portents of misfortune, death, and ruin at worst. For this reason, if a changeling was spotted in a family, besides the parents just wanting their child back, it was in their best interest to get rid of it before problems came their way, and there were various traditions for how to do this. In many countries, it was thought that torturing a changeling until it laughed would do the trick, causing it to leave and bring the human child back. In Ireland, it was thought that throwing the changeling into a fireplace would cause it to jump up the chimney and return the human child. Indeed, many countries had the tradition of using fire, otherwise heating the changeling, such as in an oven, in order to banish it. They could also be beaten and mistreated to force them to admit their true nature. In other traditions, it was enough to simply trick the changeling into speaking or laughing by any means necessary, and there were certain rituals that could be carried out as well. If a family was lucky, the changeling would just get bored and go away on its own, although there were no guarantees that the human child it had replaced would ever be returned. Yet, even with all these deterrents and weapons against the changeling's threat, many families felt compelled to care for it simply because they were afraid that something bad would happen to their real child if they did not. On occasion, this could lead to the thankful changeling giving back the human child as a reward for their kindness, but usually the changeling would remain. In some cases, the changeling would be raised as the family's child through to adulthood, with the changeling sometimes even forgetting what they really were, and believing themselves to be human. In this case, the human child they had replaced would live with the fairies forever, and would sometimes themselves forget that they had ever been human at all. There are many historical tales of changelings that grew up in human society. King Charles I of England was reportedly rumored to have been a changeling, and there is also the tale of a woman named Bridget Cleary, who was murdered by her husband in 1895 when he suspected her of being a changeling. In this particular case, from March of 1895, a young woman by the name of Bridget Cleary disappeared in Ireland, and after an extensive search for the woman, her body was finally found not far from her home. Police would finger her husband, Michael Cleary, her father, Patrick Bolland, her aunt, Mary Kennedy, her cousins, Patrick, William, James, and Michael Kennedy, and John Dunn as the killers. But under questioning, they would weave a very strange tale indeed. According to them, the real Bridget had in fact been abducted by fairies, who had then left behind a changeling in her place, a fact they uncovered when the creature became very ill for no reason. They then tied up the changeling and tortured it to find out where the real Bridget had been taken to, but it died from its injuries. According to them, the police had found the changeling's body and not that of the real Bridget. It was a colorful story, but the police weren't buying it, and they were charged with murder. The stories of changelings reverberate throughout the lore of many European countries, including the United Kingdom, Scandinavia, Poland, Spain, and others, and similar tales stretch out to Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. Why is it that such similar stories have managed to worm their way into these far-flung lands? One of the main theories in modern times is that this was a way of explaining and dealing with infants born with birth defects or deformed, developmentally disabled, or neurodivergent children, as well as those with autism. In an age when there was little to medically or scientifically explain such things, this could have perhaps been a way to rationalize such children. The parents would see these defects and convince themselves that this couldn't possibly be their child, but rather an impostor left by supernatural forces. It is horrifying in a sense, as such folklore beliefs likely led to countless instances of innocent children being mistreated, tortured, abandoned, or even killed. We may never truly know how such stories evolved or why they remain so eerily similar across geographical and cultural divides, but they certainly play into every parent's fears that something might happen to their child and remain a curious area of strange lore with deep roots in mystery. Here we have looked at just a small selection of the many accounts through the ages of fairies with decidedly dark agendas. Is there any truth to the tales, or are they strictly mythical constructs confined to spooky lore and legend? Whatever the case may be, it all adds extra layers to the phenomenon of fairies and shows that they are not always of the kind and benevolent type. Wow. When you listen to that story, a lot of the abductions almost sound like ET abductions. People forget they forget, or time moves differently for them. Very similar to some abduction stories. Pretty interesting, huh? Are fairies ETs, or ETs are fairies? What do you think? Alright guys, till next time. Let's see what else we could dig up in this weird world of ours. Take care.